Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I must say, in these last few days, Portland has been a most exciting place. I feel as though I'm really at the center of everything. And I also find Portland such a beautiful place to be, and it doesn't matter that it rains. I wanted to talk today, first of all, in a very general way about a sort of philosophical framework within which I think about some of these issues. Having to do with the brain's role in what we are and how we think, how it is that we can be aware, that we sleep, we dream, and so forth. But I want to start by thinking about the issues in the way that the ancient Greeks did, because in many ways it was their articulation of the ideas that kind of set the framework, set the stage for how we, in subsequent years, and in large measure for most of our history, thought about them. The ancient Greeks, of course, asked the questions about everything. They wanted to know how things moved, what fire was, why it was that some things were alive and some things were not. They wanted to know what the stars were, what the sun was, what the relation between all of the planetary bodies were, what the relation was to the Earth. They also asked very probing and interesting questions about humans. They wanted to know what it was about us that was similar to animals, and in some cases perhaps similar to plants, and what it was that differentiated us from animals, or from at least some animals. They wanted to know what it was about us that made us capable of using language, and how it was that humans could learn, could think, could remember, and whether or not decisions and choice were things which were really voluntary and really free. Now, as science progressed, especially, of course, during the Renaissance, many of the questions that intrigued the Greeks shifted from being questions that were thought of as questions within the domain of philosophy and became much more accessible to really systematic empirical inquiry, accessible to many different kinds of experiments, and slowly a theoretical framework was built up for, first of all, of course, astronomy, but also for physics in general, and then for chemistry, and somewhat later for biology. So many of the questions that the ancient Greeks had sort of lumped together, and which were still lumped together as part of natural philosophy, sort of hived off and became part of science. What remained at the beginning of this century were still many questions about the nature of the mind. And partly that was because techniques for looking at the brain, techniques for investigating how it is that we see or that we think and understand, were really not available. The brain is a very difficult thing to study. First of all, it doesn't look like anything. The heart looks a bit like a pump, and it's kind of easy to see what the mechanics of the heart are, although, of course, it took rather a long time for that to be figured out in detail. Movement of the arm by muscles and tendons is a relatively straightforward mechanical thing, but the brain doesn't look like anything. It doesn't look like a pump. It's not made of pulleys. And so it's very hard to see what it could be doing. It's hard to figure out what hypotheses would make sense of what the brain's mechanics actually are. The other thing, of course, is that the brain, as we now know, is made up of very tiny cells. And it really requires something like the light microscope to be able to see what the elements are that compose the brain. And of course, you really don't have a prayer of understanding the brain and how it works if you don't know what the components are and how they work. So it wasn't really until this century, with the advent of the electron microscope and electronic techniques for recording from single cells, that it became possible to begin to put together a story of how the brain works. Now, traditionally, of course, there have been two very different opinions on the relation between mental states, such as thinking and feeling and deciding, on the one hand, and physical states of the brain, physical states of the body on the other hand. And may I have the first slide, please? Some people, most famously, of course, Descartes, took the view that that psychological phenomena, well, yes, that was not his view. Took the view that psychological phenomena, in particular the phenomena of producing linguistic sequences, being able to talk to each other, being able to create new linguistic patterns, was something that was so extraordinary that he couldn't imagine how it would be possible for a mere physical device to do that. Okay. And so Descartes described himself as a dualist, as someone who answered the question, are mental phenomena actually phenomena of the brain, by saying no. There really are two very fundamentally different kinds of stuff. On the one hand, how do we work that? On the one hand, there is neural stuff, physical stuff with mass and other physical properties. It's extended in space. And on the other hand, he thought there was some very different kind of substance, which I here call soul stuff, or rather tendentiously spooky stuff. But by which I mean that it was essentially defined negatively. That is, it's not physical, it doesn't have mass, it doesn't occupy space, and so on and so forth. In this century, it has, I think, become implausible to suppose that something like dualism is true. Although there are still philosophers, Swinburne is one of them, who takes the view that there is a non-physical soul that's somehow distinct from and apart from and interacts with the brain. And the neuroscientist John Eccles is in the minority of neuroscientists, but one of the neuroscientists who does think, as Descartes did, that there has to be a non-physical soul that interacts with the brain. Now, of course, interacts was always the tough bit. And Descartes was unable to understand how it might be that an absolutely non-physical substance could interact with something that was physical. And the problem of the interaction remained a problem always for dualists and continues to be a major problem. The additional problem that has, or the additional facts that have made the dualist position seem unlikely really arise from whatever else it is that we know in science, from physics, from chemistry, and I suppose most especially from evolutionary biology. If there's anything that's clear about the human brain, it's that it evolved from other brains, that it has many, many of the same features as other primate brains, that the components that make it up are the same kinds of components, neurons, that we see in mammals generally, that we see in reptiles, in fish, in scorpions, and so forth. Many of the same neurochemicals are found in our brain and are found in all species. It looks as though our brain is probably very similar in many, many respects to the brain of chimpanzees. In fact, in its gross aspect, there is no difference, save size, that you can discern. So the position that's known as materialism has come to seem much more plausible. And that position basically says that the ancient Greek Democritus was right, that there is really just the physical brain, and somehow it's the magic of the physical brain, of the way that the neurons interact, the way that they are individually as well as the way they interact, that manages to produce all of the complexity that we are familiar with, both as we observe the behavior of others and as we introspect in our own case. The question then for many contemporary philosophers has been this: can neurobiological facts, facts about the brain itself, explain psychological facts? Can it help us explain how it is that when I do something like that, you're able to see visual motion? You're able to see the motion. Can it explain how it is that we're able to see in depth and make judgments about what's in front of something else? Can it help us explain how it is that someone can play basketball or play tennis or speak? I frame that question in the following way: will psychology reduce to neuroscience? And I really take it that those questions are equivalent, that they're essentially interchangeable and ask exactly the same thing. Philosophers, I think, are very divided at this point on whether neurobiology is going to explain very much of the nature of cognitive processes, of emotions, and so forth. There are a number of reasons why contemporary philosophers have reservations, and I want to say a little bit about what the reservations are and then explain why I am more optimistic and why I think that we can make a lot of progress in understanding the mind in terms of the brain. There is a sort of general feature, a kind of general argument that one often encounters, especially when the phenomenon under study is not very well understood, when we just don't know very much about it. And we have seen many times in the history of science arguments of the following kind. We can never understand the nature of some phenomenon X in terms of some other phenomenon Y. And the reasons given are sometimes like this: because I just can't imagine how you could do such a thing. And in the case of the mind and the brain, people have been inclined to say, I just can't imagine how it could be that you could get an explanation for my feeling of pain out of the behavior of individual neurons passing current back and forth across their membranes. I just can't imagine how you could do that. Another argument is that X and Y are just categorically different. Mental expressions are about mental things, physical expressions are about physical properties. Perhaps an equivalent way of saying we can never understand, but one which is sometimes offered as an argument, is no amount of evidence could ever show that, for example, pain in a human does consist in a set of neurons responding in a particular kind of way. Or sometimes it's argued, as the philosopher Colin McGinn does, that it's absurd or it's meaningless to suppose that we could understand the nature of psychological processes in terms of their neurobiology. So not only is the argument general, but as I've indicated, there are particular instances of it that are now applied to the question, can neurobiology reduce psychology? Jonathan Miller, for example, has said that neuroscience is forever going to be incomplete because no one can observe my awareness. Now, I think this slide was inadvertently, I was a little nervous that maybe Terry Bristol was going to give my talk. The trouble with all of these arguments that I just can't imagine thus and such being explained is that they are essentially arguments from ignorance. And those of us who teach logic teach this as a fallacy. That is to say, it's a fallacy to go from we really don't understand much at all about some phenomenon phi, so we do know that phi cannot ever be explained, or phi cannot be explained in terms of the behavior of anything else, or that phi cannot have properties P1 to Pn, and so forth. If you're starting from a position of knowledge and saying we can't explain something in a certain way, that's very different. For example, I might say, given that we have very good reason to believe that polio is caused by a virus, you can't explain someone's having polio by saying that he's in the possession of devils. But that's because we're starting from a vantage point of understanding rather than the vantage point of ignorance. Now, I suggested that my own view was more optimistic, that although it's possible that there will be things that we will not be able to understand about ourselves and how we work, that until we have, as it were, hit the wall, it's probably a good idea to keep going and to keep trying to understand. And in that context, then, I describe myself as a reductionist. And I mean something fairly minimal by reduction, and since the word reductionist is sometimes used as a way of insulting somebody else, it is sometimes a bit of a dirty word. I thought that I had best explain what I mean and what most philosophers of science mean when they talk about reduction. So very briefly, we just mean that there are level-to-level explanations, that some macro-level phenomenon is going to be understood and explained in terms of some micro-level phenomenon. Now, it's important then, since it is a dirty word, for me to indicate what I don't mean by reduction. A reductionist does not mean that purely bottom-up research strategies are the right way to go. That is, a purely bottom-up research strategy might say, the best thing to do to understand the brain is, first of all, to understand everything there is to know at the bottommost level. Understand every neuron, every synapse, and the way they connect to one another, and then move on to the next level, and then to the next. That, of course, is an unlikely research strategy. It was so for all of the other sciences, and it will be so for neuroscience as well. We need research at the behavioral level, at the level of systems, the level of large circuits of neurons, small circuits of neurons, and individual neurons. Reductionism also does not mean that the high-level descriptions, that is, descriptions of high-level properties, are in some sense disreputable or in bad odor or used only with sneer quotes or anything of that kind. High-level descriptions are essential. They're part of what we need in order to describe the phenomenon. It also does not mean that macro-level research won't inform micro-level research, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Typically, when we look at the relations between macro and micro-level theories in the history of science, what we see is that reductive contact between them happens slowly. That the macro-level theory and the micro-level theory co-evolve, by which I mean that they sort of keep an eye on one another, suggest experiments to one another, correct and revise one another, and hence slowly sort of knit together. And one of the most striking things, of course, and part of what makes science very exciting, is that it brings about revisions in the way we think about things. The revision that takes us from a geocentric to a heliocentric conception of the universe is very important. And then the movement away from a heliocentric conception to there we are way out in the fringe of the Milky Way. And science typically is full of surprises. It teaches us that some of the very conventional, familiar, and comfortable ways of thinking about things, whether it's motion or whether it's temperature or the origin of disease, or the causes of disease, that our familiar ways of thinking about those things are often not right, and that you can get a deeper understanding, a richer way of seeing the world if you revise it. And so the suggestion is that we will also see, as neuroscience and psychology co-evolve, revisions to both our current ideas about the way neurons work and our current ideas about the major psychological faculties, memory, attention, perception, and so forth. So this is just a sort of schematic summing up slide of what I mean by reduction. And it just indicates that the macro and the micro level theory make points of contact, come closer and closer. The change in color is meant to convey the idea that at some point the revisions in the major categories and the major concepts take place. And sometimes on one more than the other, but that of course depends on how the facts fall out. It's also useful when we think about the naysaying with respect to the explanations within neurobiology, to reflect on the fact that there have been lots and lots of examples in the history of science of things that seemed very reasonable at the time, given the vantage point of ignorance. It was long thought, and until sometime in this century, that you would never be able to explain the nature of living things and how it was that they were alive in terms of dead molecules, so to speak, as my biology teacher actually put it. That you would never be able to have evidence that some class of events is undetermined, and yet we do. That you would never have evidence, that it wouldn't make sense to have evidence to think that the universe had a beginning. And I know many of you were here for Stephen Hawking's lecture. That it was senseless, absurd, paradoxical, meaningless to suppose that in real space parallel lines could converge. And yet, in the real space of our planet, the real space of outer space, they do. It turns out that that's just a fact about the way gravity and light and so forth interact. A practical consideration is sometimes raised with respect to our capacity to understand neurobiologically the nature of awareness. And it's not unlike, I think, the practical problem that some people thought existed in coming to understand the composition of the stars. How it was thought, could you ever know the composition of the stars? Well, of course we do now, but the problem as they saw it was this, that in order to get the composition of the stars, you've got to first get to the star, and then, of course, you've got to get some of the stuff and then take it back and analyze it. Now, the worst part was getting close enough to the star to get the stuff, because you'd, of course, burn up. So we'd never know the composition of the stars. Notice how one's capacity to imagine how you might be able to explain something is, of course, limited by the kinds of techniques that are available. And in the absence of certain kinds of techniques, then, of course, except in the most abstract way, it isn't possible to imagine how some of these things could happen. And in this slide, I really just wanted to convey, again, the idea that our imaginations are limited by what we currently believe and by the techniques that are currently available to us. And consequently, we may sometimes be looking in the wrong place when we're looking for an explanation of a certain phenomenon. And that there's a sense in which it's not scientifically very profound, it's not metaphysically very interesting to say that there's something that you can't imagine. That is, if you like, just a comment on your own psychology, rather than a profound comment about the way the world is. Now, that sort of sums up most of what I want to say that's of a traditionally philosophical sort. And I want to move now into a domain that says a little bit more about how, in fact, things are beginning to shape up in the relation between, or in the co-evolution of neuroscience and psychology. This is a schematic characterization of the human brain, highly schematic on the bottom, just to indicate what the major structures are that anatomists describe. And then the upper part is a drawing of what the human brain would look like were it transparent and you could see through into it. The large pink objects are, this does not really seem to work terribly well. The large pink objects are in fact like empty tubes, in effect. They are the ventricles. And for a substantial part of human history, many people thought that the soul must reside in those holes, in the ventricles. And that if you really wanted to understand the way the brain worked, the most important thing to do was to understand the membrane between the hole and the brain itself. And now, of course, we think that the holes don't provide anything like a sort of seat for the soul, that what they do is contain cerebrospinal fluid, which, amongst other things, helps to nourish the brain. The brain is made up of neurons. That is, all brains, all nervous systems have as their components neurons. Neurons are cells, and they typically have a structure where the cell body, the sort of business part of the cell containing the nucleus and the other organelles, is in one place, and then there is a sort of bushy tree on top of that where the incoming signals arrive, and then it has a tail, often with many, many branches, and that's the part that sends the signals out. So neurons are clearly specialized for signaling. Red blood cells do something quite different. Muscle cells do something quite different. Neurons have been specialized through evolution to be in the business of receiving signals and in a very orderly way sending signals back. These are neurons in the in the brain of the domestic housefly. And I do wish this would work. I think it's because it's that, there it is. You can't see it terribly well. In any event, look at the black neuron here on the left. There's the cell body there, and you can see that what this part is these are the dendrites, and you can see it's a very sort of bushy affair, and that they make rather orderly connections with other cells in the region. Now, this particular slide isn't going to convey very much except the very general idea that cells talk to other cells, they communicate with other cells, and that it's the pattern of connectivity and the organization that seems to be absolutely critical for producing the complex effects, such as allowing the fly to move, to land properly, to avoid the fly swatter, and so forth. Now, this, as I indicated earlier, techniques and an understanding of what kind of techniques are available is very important as we try to figure out what we might find out about the brain that will help us explain and understand psychological phenomena. One of the recent techniques that has been available is something that seems sort of so magical and so wonderful that it was only in the dreams of neuroscientists at the beginning of the century. And this is a magnetic resonance image. Very briefly, it's obtained in the following ways. A person's head is put into a large magnetic field, and the magnetic field changes, and during those changes, things happen in the brain. That's picked up by the computer and rendered as an image. So this is, in fact, a brain not seen at autopsy, but a brain of a person who's live and well and walking around. It's mine, actually. And those of you who know any neuroanatomy will realize that some of the bits are missing. I want to assure you that this is not, this is part of the way the image was rendered. This is not a problem for me. On the back end here, normally you see a large structure called the cerebellum, which is very important for movement and so forth. But I must say that for me, I was doing this simply to be a research volunteer. It was very exciting to see something which is pretty close to me, something which has a lot to do with me being who I am and me being able to look at that very thing and to talk about it, to think about it, to wonder about how it works. Of course, some things are not shown. The sort of envelope of membranes on top is not shown, nor are the many blood vessels. One of the very important applications of magnetic resonance imagery, MRI, is that it can be used on patients with strokes, which helps identify precisely what region was lost or damaged, and that helps us see in a general way what areas of the brain are specialized for certain kinds of tasks. In this case, this is the rear end of the brain. Over on the right is the front end of the brain. We know that the region here is very important for vision. and that when that region is damaged, very often people are blind. If, however, that region is spared and something slightly more forward is damaged, patients who have a stroke in that area often can see reasonably well, but they've often lost the capacity to identify what it is that they're seeing. They can't recognize something as a toothbrush, as a car, as a telephone, as a dog. Further forward in region of the temporal lobe, again, the patient may be quite able to see and functions normally in every respect, save that they have lost the capacity to recognize faces. They can no longer recognize that this woman is his wife, that these are his children, that that is the president, and cannot any longer recognize that that is himself as he looks in the mirror. There are other regions that are especially important for the auditory system. How exactly the auditory system that enables you to hear and the visual system interact is not known, but you can see it isn't as though there's a sort of clearly separable module for one part and another clearly separate module for some other faculty. So one of the things that makes the brain so deeply puzzling, but it also seems to be the thing that makes it so computationally powerful, is that things are very interconnected with one another. That information seems to be distributed in a very broad way over many parts of the brain, rather than, as in a conventional computer, stored in one precise location. The brain is also surprisingly fault tolerant. By which I mean that if the lesions are small and in certain regions, then other parts of the brain seem to be able to compensate for that loss. And after a period of time, there is often substantial recovery of function. So the MRI technique then has been especially important in allowing us to gain access to the relation between general features of the brain or general regions of the brain and specific capacities, such as the capacity to see faces. But of course, we also need to be able to understand very clearly what's going on at the neural level to be able to connect those two things. Now, I wanted to, rather than just say in a general way what the techniques are that are available to neurobiology that help us achieve this sort of co-evolutionary progression, I want to look a little bit closely at a specific example where, although, like everywhere else in neuroscience, we don't yet, of course, have the full story, but where we can see data at the topmost level, the behavioral level, and data at the level of the single cell, beginning to sort of come together in a way that looks very promising. There are many areas where progress, and really quite stunning progress, is being made in neuroscience, especially, I guess, in the field of learning and memory, in the field of sensory perception in general, but vision in particular, and also in understanding attentional mechanisms. And at a more general level, the difference between what's going on in the brain during deep sleep, during dreaming, and during the waking state is slowly being pieced together and understood. And it's helping us understand one of the really big questions, of course, and that is, what is it for a brain to be aware of something? And perhaps the most profound or sort of troubling question within philosophy has long been, how do you get experience out of meat? And if we are to understand that, if we are to be able to get an answer to that question, then really the first question we must ask ourselves is this: what's the difference in the brain in the following two conditions? In the one condition, the stimulus is presented and I am aware, and in the other condition, the stimulus is presented and I'm not aware. What's the difference in the brain? Given the variety of techniques, MRIs and positron emission tomography and other techniques at a very large scale level and micro techniques at the small scale level, we should be able to make some progress in that question. Now, one place that where we see a dramatic difference between being aware and not being aware is, of course, in sleep and dreaming and the awake state. We're very much not aware in deep sleep. Now, in this particular slide and the top panel, what is shown are the various stages of sleep. And you'll see they're described as various levels. And initially, the person is awake here on the right, goes down into deeper sleep, and then it changes a little bit, and in the area marked with black, the person is in dreaming state. Now, there's some profound changes that happen in the brain, but one of the most striking things is that the general level of activity, as recorded by an electroencephalogram, looks very much the same in the awaking state and in the dreaming state, and rather different in the dreaming state, in the deep sleep state. It's important to realize that the brain never turns off. It's extremely active, highly busy, tons of things going on in all of the states. So it isn't that during sleep, basically everything just shuts down. Lots of things are going on, but they're different things. And of course, in both deep sleep and in dreaming, you're not aware of external stimuli. Largely, you're not aware. If the baby whimpers, then you wake up, and sometimes the alarm clock wakes you up, and so on. Now, so that's at a very general level. It also turns out that recently it has been discovered, mainly by Alan Hobson and his group at Harvard, that there are very special changes that also happen in the brainstem having to do with arousal, and that's meant to be conveyed in the lower panel. There are two sets of cells. The pink ones are called locus coeruleus cells, and the blue ones are called giant pontine cells. Each of them produces a different chemical. The locus coeruleus cells produce norepinephrine. The giant pontine cells produce acetylcholine. Now, in this graph, the general idea is that during the waking state, the locus coeruleus cells are extremely active. And then their activity declines during delta sleep, during deep sleep, and then they are much less active. Of course, there is still some activity, but much less active during the dreaming state. The opposite profile is seen for the giant pontine cells, which become very active during the dreaming state. Now, these begin to at least allow us to ask the next question about what it is that distinguishes dreaming from being awake, from being in deep sleep. Now, rather quickly, I want to take you through a little bit of data that bears on this. There is another technique, which I have not yet talked about, but which also involves magnetism, magnetoencephalography. And it consists in putting sensors on the side, in this case on the side of the head. And basically what happens is that the sensors detect any electrical changes in activity in the brain. In this instance, this work was done by Rodolfo Linus and his colleagues at New York University, and they had a number of sensors on the side of the head, and these are recordings shown over a period of a little more than half a second. What was striking about the results from this was as follows. They took the recordings in three different states. In the top state, the subject was awake. In the B state, the subject was in delta sleep, in deep sleep. And in the C state, the subject was dreaming, as determined by other techniques. And D just shows the intrinsic noise from the machine itself. See, the important differences are between A, B, and C. It turns out that in all of those states, what we see is a very robust 40 hertz oscillation. It's there in relatively high amplitude in the awake state and relatively high amplitude in the dreaming state, and it mushes out considerably in the delta sleep state. And that's shown a little more dramatically in this instance where we are not averaging them across many trials. There, the subject is asleep, but notice the very high amplitude changes both in the awake state and in dreaming. Well, what does that mean? An additional fact that's worth mentioning here, and again, it helps us understand something about how the brain manages to make things coherent. such that you do have a sort of integrated representation of things in awareness. When they looked, this doesn't matter whether this is rapid eye movement sleep, just means dreaming sleep. You'll see the same effect in both the wake state and the dreaming state. In this instance, what we do is take a trace that's averaged over a number of trials. Now, just take a little bit of that, this little bit here that we're interested in, and expand it so we can have a really good look at it. And then just take that little bit there and expand that so we can have a really good look at that. Then what they did was as follows. They said, well, look, let's just number the sensors from front to back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then let's see the relationships in the waves between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And what they noticed is that the waves are just slightly advanced with respect to one another. That is, that they are phase shifted front to back. It's as though there is a sort of 12 millisecond wave passing across the cortex from front to back. And that the amplitude changes during the awake state and the dreaming state. Well, what can that mean in terms of the cellular level? I mean, if we don't talk about it at the cellular level, then it's just sort of a very general, very broad description. Very briefly, it turns out that most neurons have to go through the thalamus in order to reach the cortex if they're coming from the sensory systems, from the eyes and the ears and so forth. Within the thalamus, there is a little structure, a sort of bagel-like structure called the intralaminar nucleus. And the intralaminar nucleus has the very interesting property that its cells project to the cortex in this nice, orderly fashion. Indeed, in just the fashion that you would expect to see given that front-to-back phase-shifted wave. Moreover, and now we are really starting to get down to the properties of cells, it turns out that the individual cells in here oscillate at 40 hertz. They show a nice rhythmic 40 hertz pattern during the awake state, during the dreaming state, and not during deep sleep. Now, it still doesn't help us understand everything that we would like to know, obviously, but it does advance the project so that we can begin to ask further questions. And the next question we want to know is, why is the signal not integrated into the dream, at least not normally, the outside signals during dreaming, but why is it that we are aware of the outside world in the awake state? So they presented a signal during the three stages. While the person was asleep, they sounded a tone for a brief sort of half-second period. Basically, this slide is a little too complicated, I guess, for me to go into in the time I have left. Basically, the difference is this, that in the awake state, the signal caused a sort of resetting of the 40 hertz. And so that what it looked like, given the front-to-back waves, is that you had a sort of much more coherent waveform. And that doesn't happen in the dreaming state. Now, this still, of course, isn't going to tell us, really what it is to be aware when you're dreaming or what it is to be aware when you're awake. But now that we can see both at the macro level and at the micro level what some of these differences are, we should be able to make the additional steps. And so I take this work, along with much other work in neuroscience, for example, on memory and on vision, to be a very good and exciting example of how there is a sort of coevolution, a kind of coming together of macro-level theories and micro-level theories of what's going on. And in my final slide, I just mean to, again, in a very schematic way, pick up the theme that I began with. And that is that the ancients asked questions, that's way up there at the top right. The ancients asked questions about all kinds of things, what we now think of as separate disciplines of biology, of mathematics, astronomy, physics, and chemistry. To them, it was all natural philosophy. And one very crude, but I think rather useful way of seeing the history of science is to see, as it were, the mother-son of philosophy sort of flinging out the various disciplines as they become empirically more accessible, as techniques are developed for making the study of those phenomena more systematic, and as a real theoretical framework grows for addressing questions about those phenomena. What's especially, I think, exciting about where we are right now in the history of science is that we are seeing this happen with neuroscience and psychology. We are, as it were, on the brink of a number of mini revolutions and perhaps major revolutions in how we think about ourselves and how we understand what it is to be a self, to be able to speak, to be able to learn and to think. Thank you very much. This doesn't work anyway, does it? Yeah. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. I gather there are microphones sort of strategically placed in various aisles, and yes, and also, gosh, I didn't realize that was all up there. Right. Okay. I can't see which person you mean. Oh, yeah, right. Okay. Would you care to start?
Yes, ma'am. I have a picture at home in Science News magazine. It's about 5 years old. 2 separate individuals killed in a car wreck, cutaway views of their brain. They're both identical. They have a large fold of gray matter in the front, and nobody knows what for. And they're both dyslexic. Can you tell me anything about that?
Well, no. but no, let me not be facetious about it, actually, because there is, I think, some extraordinary work being done right now on dyslexia, and in an attempt to try to understand what the neurobiological differences are. Again, part of the reason I like the work is that it makes so much sense to me, because I can see it, what it looks like at the macro level and how it's working together with what we know at the micro level. Let me tell you a little bit about what the macro level results are, and then a little bit about how neurobiologically it's interesting. Paula Talal is the person who made the particular discovery I'm going to talk about. She had a large population of dyslexics who were otherwise neurologically normal and of normal intelligence. And she discovered that they had an impairment in doing timing tasks. And the timing tasks that she would set for them would be to hear a series of tones and then to reproduce that series by tapping some buttons. Normal children were able to do it very easily, even when the interval between the tones was very short. But dyslexic children had a lot of trouble when the tones were presented in a fast sequence, or when there were a number of them, when there were more than 2. She found then that the timing task in any modality, that is whether it was hearing or vision or somatosensory touch, that the dyslexics always had a more difficult time than the normal children. So her apprehension, the hypothesis that she has, and that we're now looking at the micro level, is that the reason that dyslexic children are not able to read is, first of all, that they are language impaired.
I wasn't interested in their abilities. I was interested in the physical brain structure itself.
Yeah.
The fact that the 2 brains were identical, they said that they made the presumption that all brains of dyslexic children would have that same identical structure.
Well, I guess I'm not quite sure what that structure was.
They said there was a large fold, a large bundle of gray matter that nobody knew what for.
Yeah, well, that's most of it. I'm sorry, I really would like to be able to answer that, but I can't. Why don't I finish what I talked about? Okay. And anyhow, the theory is that dyslexic children are language impaired because they can't make these fast phonetic discriminations. That it's not specifically, that is in certain kinds of dyslexia at any rate, it's not specific to language, it has to do with temporal discriminations. Now, there are many, many kinds of dyslexia, and this would pertain to only one kind. So they're now looking at the microstructure. I don't want to give another talk. I'm sorry. I think you were next.
Quick comment. I read an article in Professional Psychology some years ago that made the insightful comment that finding a neuron that controls a particular behavior is like finding a street in Philadelphia using a map of the Milky Way. Nevertheless, I understand there has been some progress in neural network modeling, and recently I read another article describing some network modeling using parallel distributed processing, I believe is the technical term, that has been computer modeled now on how a person might approach certain problem-solving tasks. Do you know of this research, and could you comment on it?
Yeah. It would take me rather a long time to say very much that's useful about it. But perhaps I should say this, that the book, The Computational Brain, that I and Terry Sainovsky wrote, really addresses those particular issues. And that is, what exactly are neural nets as kind of computers? How is it that they can compute? What can we learn about real neural nets and real nervous systems from model neural nets? And I think that there's a lot to be learned. I guess I wouldn't have written the book otherwise, but I think that if we are going to get to the middle level of organization to understand how neurons interact with one another to produce complex effects, we're going to have to look at neural modeling in order to be able to generate hypotheses as to what those middle layers are doing. So I think it's very important. It's only $39.50. MIT Press, yes. Was there another question?
Yes, up here.
Yes.
Okay.
Wherever you go. Well, the funny thing is the sound comes from here. So, of course, my ear, my head turns this way. But now I see you, yes.
On the TV series Bill Moyer's Healing of the Mind that was on recently, there's one segment in which they were talking about the mind-body dichotomy. And they were talking with, I think, a neurobiologist. And she was saying that not only is the mind in the brain, but the mind is in the body. The mind is the body. There's no dichotomy. And I wonder if you worked with that, because it seems like your talk is more talking about the mind in the brain as opposed to the mind being the body.
Yeah. I have to confess, first of all, I didn't see the series. But that sounds like Candace Pert. Was that right? Yeah. And I have chatted with her about this idea. What moves her to say that is this, that there are connections between the nervous system and the immune system. And they're very poorly understood at this point, and it's nothing like the connections between one part of the brain and another part of the brain. So it may be useful to say the broader thing that Candace Pert prefers to say. But it seems to me that at this point, it's the brain that is particularly crucial for thinking and reasoning and seeing and so forth. It isn't the feet, right? And it isn't the kidney, and although, obviously, if you don't have a functioning kidney and you die, then your brain's not working either. Destruction to certain part of the kidneys does not affect how you reason and see and move about and so forth. It looks like the brain plays a very special role. But of course, the brain is not unconnected to the glands. It's not unconnected to the immune system. And it's not unconnected to the heart and the lungs and so forth either. But if we can understand the brain first, then we might, expand our horizons. Any?
Yes, my question is, would you like to make comment on Alzheimer's disease and the current theories?
I'll try. The research is continuing on Alzheimer's disease, but Alzheimer's disease is very, very puzzling. We know that part of what happens is that there is sort of massive destruction, although on a time scale, of neurons in the cortex. What we don't understand is why that happens, why it happens in some people and not in others. One hypothesis for a time was that aluminum might play some special role in it, and that perhaps people who used aluminum pots or something of that nature were more susceptible. And the aluminum hypothesis has been looked at very, very closely, and it does not seem to be anything there. So we can certainly recognize the disease, and we know that it's terribly, terribly destructive. And it's certainly one of the cruelest diseases on the planet. But we don't really know yet what causes it. I think we will find out, but it was going to take a while.
Could you say a word or two about the micro and the learning process, both from the micro and the macro contextual level?
And what learning consists in? Yeah. Again, this is a very long story on, several lectures in its own right. But I'll try to say two things, one fairly general and one rather more specific. The general thing is this: it looks like there are a lot of different mechanisms and a lot of different kinds of processes involved in learning. It looks like learning skills and certain kinds of procedures, sometimes called procedural learning, is probably done by a rather different system from the system that learns and remembers specific events, such as where you parked your car when you came here. And that you can have damage to the system that is responsible for learning specific episodes and events that leaves intact the capacity to still learn skills and procedures. It looks like conditioning is a little bit different from either of those. It looks like there's a phenomenon called priming, which is different from those yet again. So it looks like there's a lot of different kinds of plasticity, and they're all going to involve how one neuron interacts with another, and it's going to involve strengths of connections between one and another. But the principles that govern those various types of learning and the structures that are involved are going to vary. So that's part of the answer. Now, the specific thing is that quite a lot of work has been done, especially by Bill Greeno at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, comparing both performance and neuron structure in the case of rats, baby rats put into and raised in a very impoverished environment, boring old glass cage, rats in a toy-rich environment with tons of stuff to do, and rats in a socially rich environment. To make a long story short, the impoverished rats learn maze learning and other tasks at a much slower rate than the rats in the rich learning environments. And when they did the histology, that is to say, looked at specific cellular organization, what they found was that, grossly speaking, the brains were larger in the case of the environmentally rich rats, and that cell by cell, when they looked at them, the arborization of the bushy part, the incoming part, as well as the branching of the tail part was much richer and much more elaborate in the case of the environmentally rich rats. What exactly that means for other capacities, what it means for humans, what it means for, how to raise your children and so forth, that remains very much an open question. But it does establish, the work of Greeno, that there is a relationship between literal change in the neuron itself, in its growth and its number of synapses and number of branches in its tree, and environment. They were all fed the same thing, by the way, just in case that was a concern. They all got as much to eat and drink as they wanted. Yeah.
Has anyone observed physiological changes in the brain that correlate to the changes of emotions?
Yes. Yes. The emotions are less well studied than, say, something like vision, where it's so much clearer how to do experiments and how to control what the input is and how to control, how to measure the output. And consequently, it's only been very recently that people have been able to really branch out and do the more complicated thing of addressing things like fear and anger and so forth. It looks like there are some structures that are particularly important, and one of them is sort of deep in the brain, sort of tucked way inside, called the amygdala. And it also looks like emotion plays a very important role in learning, and that part of the sort of whole reinforcement learning story is going to depend on the emotions. We also know that in human subjects, there was a new book about to come out by Antonio Damasio from Iowa, the guy who did the MRI on me, that addresses the issue of the emotions and the brain. And he looks at it from the perspective of neuropsychology, meaning he's looked at a number of patients with particular kinds of lesions, where the lesions result in improper or absence of emotional response. In several cases, these were as a result of stroke. In one case, as a result of surgery to remove a tumor.
I guess I was hoping that somebody had looked at a subject, a live subject, that was undergoing a rather dramatic emotional change and asked the question, was anything observed?
Well, something sort of close to that has actually been done. And again, it's only very recent, and that's because the techniques are new. But positron emission tomography is a technique that involves using radioactive material, translating what comes off into a computer so you can see what in the brain is especially active under the relevant conditions. The group in Washington University in St. Louis were looking at people who had various kinds of phobias and who would have an attack. In fact, they were looking, first of all, I guess, at people with panic attack. And they would have a panic attack during the test, and that would show up as an especially bright and especially active area deep in the brain, mainly the amygdala and another area called the cingulate gyrus. So that's a start, but it doesn't tell you, I know, whatever else we would really like to know about these things and what's different between, say, fear and anger or fear and embarrassment or fear and hope and so on. Yeah.
We have questions up here, please.
Yeah.
It seems that most of the empirical studies that have been done on the brain have treated the brain as a self-contained organism, but there seems to be at least a fairly commonly accepted belief of extracranial activity, either confined to extrasensory connection between two individuals, or even hypothesis regarding collective consciousness where all the brains are tapped together. I don't know if there's any empirical evidence to support this, or if there are just too many people with time on their hands in grocery store lines reading magazines. What that would imply, though, is that the brain is not only a self-contained mechanism, but also acts as some sort of a transceiver device, right, receiving and sharing signals through outside sources. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, as a philosopher, I get to sort of branch out a bit. And so I was very intrigued by that question at one point. So I looked at the data quite carefully to see whether there was any significant evidence to show that there was something like extrasensory perception or that there was brain-to-brain communication, but not through the usual physical means such as language and so forth. And I'm sorry to have to report that the data are just amazingly terrible. That there, first of all, the literature is simply, the literature in parapsychology is, I hope I'm not offending anybody, but it has to be said, is littered with fraud. And that makes it very difficult for almost any researcher to distinguish whether he might have in fact got something that was genuine and good, or whether it was all fraudulent, in some cases made up by the researcher himself or by his confederates and so forth. What? Can't hear. And so I came away from my survey of the literature very discouraged. Now, if anybody has any real data, they should publish it. But the other thing is that you see in the non-fraudulent data, the best that you see are these minor, minuscule, probably insignificant statistical results. And so they're so small and so minor and so apparently insignificant that it doesn't look like it supports anything. On the other hand, every controlled study of extrasensory perception and the paranormal, where it has really been rigorously done, has come up empty-handed. Now, the parapsychologists say yes, but that's because when you have all that rigor, the effect, it's called the shyness effect. And so when you have all that rigor, the phenomena prefers not to show itself. This is not to say that such a thing is impossible or that somebody won't, have good evidence. All I'm saying is at the moment, I can't find one single experiment that looks the least bit convincing.
Another question.
No, I mean, I could imagine it, but I just don't see it.
Another question up top.
Yeah, sorry.
In the face of the marvelous technological and philosophical advances that are exploring the brain as a substrate of experience, it seems to me that we're still stuck, or at least I am stuck, at what seems to be an impasse between the material and the phenomenal, which is to say, while we may be able to chart the physiology of the experience of pain or fear or anger as it may originate in the amygdala, we are still falling short of describing in tangible, empirical sorts of terms what constitutes that experience we know as fear or rage.
Oh yeah, we haven't got there yet.
And well, that leads to kind of a second question, which is that impasse, in your opinion, due to a failure in our technology? That is to say, we haven't developed the technology in this year, 1993, that allows us to understand the phenomenology of awareness and experience as human beings, for example. Or is it that awareness is an epiphenomenon of sorts of the physiology of the brain? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I guess, my hypothesis is that we eventually will understand awareness in neurobiological terms. That's not to say that, I could ever have your awareness. After all, you have your brain and I have mine. So, and it might be that I can't investigate my own awareness, but that's quite consistent with my being able to investigate somebody else's and to be able to say, well, when the neurons are coordinated by the 40 hertz waves and thus in such a way, and when you have, then the person is aware of pain. That's my hypothesis, is that we will be able to do that. And I haven't yet, I guess, seen any reason to be tremendously discouraged that we won't be able to do that. I'm assuming that it looks doable. It seems to me it's not an epiphenomenon. It's probably awareness is there for good computational reasons. It's probably in lots of other animals, certainly in primates, probably your dog, your cat, and who knows what else. But the idea that we alone have it, or that it's somehow epiphenomenal, not really causally connected to anything in the brain, strikes me as not likely. But on the other hand, I don't rule out any research program, and if somebody wants to do research on that hypothesis, they should do it.
Sort of as a follow-up to that question, do you feel that there's a strong correlation between our awareness of pain and our awareness of the awareness of pain? And can
Yeah.
approach the latter.
Yeah, I've never been too impressed with my awareness of pain, because, you know, it's always just awareness of pain. I mean, I may be lacking something other people have. But, you know, it's really important to bear in mind that we don't know how I can touch my nose. And I notice, though, that philosophers don't say, you know, that's so mysterious. It must be unexplainable by science how it is that I can touch my nose. And yet there is this inclination to find experience and awareness so amazing that, but you know, what's amazing and what isn't amazing depends on what you know and what you don't know. And since we know so little, we find most things about the brain absolutely amazing. I guess I can take maybe 2 more questions and
Had one up here.
then, okay. I think that the general consensus seems to be the upstairs is getting favored treatment here, but go ahead.
Given on the one hand, you're putting it a little simple-mindedly, your notion that ultimately all emotion and creativity, et cetera, can be explained by the properties of neurons and connections between them. And on the other hand, the growing evidence, I think, that you can put together computer elements that mimic neurons and their connections in many ways. Would it then follow that ultimately one can build a machine that can have all these emotions and creativity?
Probably. I'm sorry. I think so. And it may be that to get a machine that has the flexibility and the sort of computational power, the computational efficiency of nervous systems, you have to do things like build in something that's comparable to emotions. We don't know yet, but it could be that in order to get a machine to learn by reinforcement learning, for example, on its own, that you have to have in there something that's comparable to feeling pain and feeling pleasure. But, I mean, this is still really, you know, sort of in the misty future of science fiction. So, yeah.
I have another related question on artificial neural networks.
Yeah.
In today's technology of computers, as I understand it, we can build computers that are tremendously fast switches that operate on the femtosecond time scale, whereas in biological systems, although they are extremely bifurcated, extremely complex, they only operate really at the millisecond and microsecond time scale. Mm-hmm. How optimistic are you that these two fields are going to be able to iterate towards some common ground and perhaps build a computer that can be used as a control to help us better understand biological systems? And on the flip side, can we possibly bioengineer biological systems that will help us better understand computers?
Yeah, I mean, that's in a way what the book is about, the computational brain. It's about both of those issues. And you're quite right, of course, to point out that in nervous systems, the components are relatively slow. That is, they operate in the millisecond range, 10 to the minus 3. Components in electronic computers operate in the 10 to the minus 9, in the nanosecond range. But the interesting thing is how fast the nervous system as a whole is and how many operations per second we can do. The housefly, the tiny little brain that it has, maybe 100,000 neurons, does about, when it's just kind of, you know, kicking back, about 10 to the 11 operations per second, which is a lot faster than the fastest computer. And that's, of course, because it has a parallel design, and that's how it manages to get so much speed. So the exciting thing, I think, for computer engineering is to exploit the parallel design that nature stumbled onto and use these also very fast components from electronics and make something that is very fast and maybe very small. One more question? Oh, okay, yes, sorry?
I sent a question up to you, and it didn't seem like you were getting to it. telling me about a boy who is surviving on his brain stem. He does everything he does well. Can you tell me
Where
a
is
bit
this
more about
person?
that? Someone was telling me that she's
Yeah.
reasonably intelligent. She said that all he had was like the brain stem.
Right. Yeah, it's hard for me to comment on those sorts of cases because, first of all, sometimes they are, shall we say, overinterpreted by the press. I mean, you know, it's sort of fun, I guess. But so I guess I would just have to look at it to know. It sounds very unlikely that this person could be doing, you know, all of the normal functions with only the brain stem. And either there is more stuff there and it hasn't been, and the person hasn't been scanned with an MRI or whatever, so the claim is that they only have a brain stem, but nobody really knows that, or else they really can't do all those things. But we'd have to look and see. Okay, since I sort of cut you off, let's have one last question then.
Thank you. I have a question with reference to Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained.
Right.
First, what do you think of his pandemonium model? And second, what do you think is the weakest part of his whole presentation?
Okay. I think there are many really interesting things in the book, and I know Dan Dennett very well, and I know his work very well, and I think that some of the very general ideas about consciousness are quite provocative. On the other hand, I do have a lot of reservations about it because some of the hypotheses that he generates are really sort of biologically naive in the sense that they're inspired more by engineering considerations and thinking about the way brains ought to do things than by, I mean, of course, biology always surprises us because brains never do things the way engineers think they ought to do things. And so many of the claims that he makes about the way the brains must be doing things turn out to be wrong. So that he has this long discussion of filling in, as though it's a non-real phenomenon. The brain, he says, really ignores something rather than provides something. And I gave a talk earlier at Reed on this, and the evidence is just overwhelming, both at the cellular level and at the level of visual experimentation, that filling in is a real phenomenon. Not only that, but as someone was telling me at lunch today, it's probably that a lot of what we do at every cognitive level is kind of filling in. Anyhow, but I think there is much in the book, and it's well worth reading. Thank you.